last night. And this region's got a rather high number of reports when you really get to looking. And also, one of the correlations they talk about is bears. Now, I am also a biologist. I've done work with the Oklahoma Academy of Science. And recently, we established there is a population of bears in this part of the state that nobody knew about. Primarily, the cross timbers are divided into the eastern cross timbers and the western cross timbers. There's a little bit of a difference. This is eastern cross timber here, the western. It's a little bit more dry, a little more arid. Trees are a little bit rougher. And we are actually at the edge of what I call the cross timber swamps. It's kind of a broken marshland that extends up into Pottawatomie County, parts of Cleveland County, a little bit along the plain, and it's one of the areas where we consistently hear about these creatures at. And the broken timbers actually describes the cross timbers, which are kind of a mixed area where you've got big patches of woods, but they're connected by waterways, and they go through big chunks of prairie. And the creeks in this region are very deep cut. Quite often these creeks are 25, 30 feet down, and when you get down to the bed, it's nothing but flat. And anything moving down these creeks can just walk under the bridges and stay out of sight. And they lead invariably to other big stands of timber. In fact, some of these creeks are in a region I'm starting to look at now. We call them the deer runs because the deer hit these things, and I mean, they just book it down them. But most of the sightings in these areas that are road crossings occur on the back country roads at night where they can't simply walk under a bridge. They have to cross the dirt road. You go a little bit further west, and people wouldn't expect nothing out there, but the fact remains, the western half of the state, when you get out, out past El Reno and down in there, that is hands down the most remote regions in the state. You can drive for an hour in between towns, and I'm not talking major cities. I am talking little towns. If you drive out into the Panhandle, I don't know if any of y'all have ever been out there, but you best guess up in between towns. And again, the belts of cross timber extend deep in there, and some of the highest numbers, concentration-wise, of deer are actually reported in this region of the state. Well, one of the arguments is there's not enough food out there to support them. Well, we got deer, cattle, and all the other wildlife, but in addition to the creeks, there's a lot of self-maintaining stock tanks out there. That one was taken out near Woodward, near the North Canadian River. And that windmill is steadily pumping water out year-round. It is a permanent water source. Some of the early sightings in Oklahoma include the Muddy Creek Monster. It really came to prominence in 1942, but there were sightings going back earlier. Before people heard of Bigfoot, that was kind of the big thing right there. Some girls reported seeing it out in the pasture. Footprints have been found. Sightings continued in the area. I actually took a sighting report from a couple of hunters that were down on the Red River in this region. And what had happened is these guys were out hunting, and they had their backs to trees. Each one had their back to a cottonwood tree. And the idea was the guy looking at this guy could tell him if he saw game down there, and the guy facing in would whip back out and shoot their supper. Well, they started to doze off, and they woke up and started smelling this horrible smell. And what happened is the guy looked up, and this thing was reaching around the cottonwood, and he yelled, and the guy went to stand up, and this thing jerked back, and when it did, it actually briefly got a hold of this guy and ripped the coat sleeve right off his arm. I mean, this guy was scared, and it was his younger brother telling me about this. And he said his they went out there the next day and they said they found footprints that were about 20 inches long. And they were kind of really scared, and they tried to bring the cops in, and the cops wanted nothing to do with it. But they said some of the hunters in the area actually started telling them stories about the Muddy Creek Monster and how it's been there forever and it won't bother them. It was just trying to mess with them a little bit. Go on there. There's a place called the Lost Mountains in the 60s. There was some sightings out there. And there's actually a drawing on the internet that a little girl drew, and it's mislabeled as being in eastern Oklahoma. But it's actually from the Lost Mountains. And it was really a neat drawing because it's a good, she did a good detailed sketch of it face to face, but I didn't have permission to show that one, so go on. 1968, there was the Oakwood Gorilla Scare, which is one of the more famous Bigfoot scares in Oklahoma. There was a lot of reports in the 60s. Deward Whetstone, I was actually trying to get in touch with him, but he passed away recently, as I found out not too long ago. He cast some very large footprints out there in the Oakwood, Canton area. And when I'm talking about people seeing it, there were cops on patrol seeing it, farmers seeing it. They were all getting kind of worked up about this. This is actually one of the strongest pieces of evidence in my mind to come out of Oklahoma. Between 1967 and 1970, just north of El Reno, there were a lot of encounters with what they call the Chicken Man. This thing was raiding chicken houses. And at one point, it leaves a handprint on the door that when they dust, they find the print. Well, they send this print off to, trying to remember the old boy's name, but he was the primatologist and curator at the Oklahoma City Zoo. And he got other primatologists to look at this print, along with forensics experts working with the OSBI. And they could not identify it. They said this, whatever this was, it was something unknown to science. It was something that was a primate, and it was something that was physical. So what you have right there is a piece of evidence that completely resisted scientific examination and scrutiny. In 1971, there was a series of sightings in the Wichita Mountains, and I might add that this area is still kind of active today. They were describing this thing. They said it looked like the old 1950s Wolfman makeup. And there was actually a report that was in the later part of 1970 or 69 of a woman going out there and seeing a Bigfoot pulling some clothes off her line. And then, just a few months later, this thing gets seen on the edge of town wearing clothes that are way too small. It's just one of those weird things you hear about from time to time, but you think about it, as curious as these things are, they can kind of get into it. The stories were pretty interesting. There was a series of encounters out there. The soldiers out at Fort Sill actually had an encounter with it where they chased it across the refuge. And kind of move on. 1982, there was the report of what they called the Vicey Sewer Man. A boy hunting coyotes on the creek encountered a 5-foot reddish Bigfoot. Since then, I've also learned that his other family members of his family saw it that winter. And it's still kind of reported from time to time in the area. That's actually a photo not too terribly far from where this occurred. And then the famous casino footage. The tribe claims the original film was lost. Several people have seen it, and the night this happened, there were about at least a half dozen independent witnesses all reported seeing this. And what had happened is this Bigfoot came out from back behind the casino, walked here, ducked under a 10-foot storage light, and started raiding trash. And like I said, this is kind of one of the more famous pieces, even though the original hasn't been seen in a pretty good while. In 2001, Dr. Charles Hallmark got a Bigfoot on film in the Argonne. And it's worth noting, you can kind of see the creature right here, and it's worth noting that this area is one of the areas that has consistently had reports. And this is the thermal hit we can move kind of on. Darren already briefly touched on it. I will add that that thermal was taken in the middle of wintertime when there was nobody swimming, nobody wading in the water that we know of. I mean, I wouldn't want to go wading in water that's got ice forming on it. Don't know about you guys. And this is kind of an example, Camo County. Again, the western part of the state's not really thought of as being conducted to sightings, but just in this brief sample here, you've got some, several instances of Bigfoot being seen and evidence being seen in one region. Again, this is an area where there's not supposed to be any Bigfoot at, but they're apparently there. This is some of the research sites that we hit up. The area we were at last night, I'm referring to as the Frog Pond area on here. And we've had, in fact, last night we got some whoops out there. We've cast footprints. In fact, I've got some hair samples that were taken directly from one of the footprints that are back in that case back there. Site 15, that's another area we hit up. We spotlighted a baby there last year, and when we did, Mama jumped across the creek at us. It's kind of an intense situation, and it's one of the areas we've really been hitting up more and more frequently. Toxic timbers is actually the primary area I research, and it has yielded an almost retarded amount of sightings. As last month when I was tallying the sightings, and I got more since then, that area has had over 89 Class A sightings. And that is in McLean County, the county right next to us. And it's not just me. I'm talking to the local people out there, and they're coming forward because I'm one of the locals. The research site that's in the next picture is a place we call Briar Hell. And I'm not prone to calling any place savage, but if you were to go into Briar Hell, I will call this place savage. Just about every snake in there is venomous. There are bears in there, as we recently discovered. There are very large canids in there that some of the biologists suspect might be a remnant population of the Oklahoma red wolf, which is supposed to be extinct. Okay, the CNRA is kind of a famous spot. We hit that up a lot. That's where the thermal footage was taken. We've got some casts down there. The other place is a newer research area called Booger Cemetery. And it's kind of an area with a bit of a history about being haunted, and we're kind of excited about there. We've got some good research coming out of there. The Runestone area is one of our more active spots. Every time we have been in there, we have had something happen. Either a sighting, a footprint find, vocal. And we call it the Runestone area because there's what appears to be Viking runestones carved on the rocks back in there. So it's kind of an interesting area. That's actually the spot where myself, Glenn, and several of the other researchers were sitting on a log. We're all pretty big guys, and something picks the log up from the end that's overgrown with brush with all of us on it. So yeah, it's an interesting area. Another place that we've started kind of researching is Boggy Creek. And I know that one technically falls in the eastern range, but we've been going down there a little bit. And we've got a couple of interesting things that have happened. So Turkey Timbers is an area we've been hitting up a lot lately too. That's a spot in Grady County, as is Monster Mesas. Two different locations. And what's interesting is we've had activity in both spots on the same night, implying that there's two different groups of these animals in that area, or one big group that splits apart. This talks a little bit about Bigfoot and the Arbuckles. There was some 1800 reports from the Chickasaw Indians when they moved in the area. 1919, a group of miners near Davis tracked what they thought was a ghost. And this ghost was leaving footprints and coming up around the cabin at night and beating on walls and howling. And again, this is activity that kind of occurs to this day. That's actually an eyewitness sketch that I worked on with a guy that said he saw some kind of mutant bear. And he said, when I drew it out, he pretty much said that's what it looked like. And right up in there, when they're on all fours, it's kind of what their prints look like. And that's what he said the prints it left look like. It's a picture of a 14-inch footprint that we cast in the Arbuckles. The cast didn't turn out near as well as the footprint looked. It's kind of hard to make out, but there's a toe, 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 toe. And that cast is actually back there. When researching in this area, the vocalizations are a little different. A lot of places you go in, you start hearing them vocalized just at dark. A lot of times out here, the calls are much later at night. They're kind of a little more stealthy out here. When they get close to human settlements, they will give off mimic calls out here. What we mean by a mimic call is something that sounds similar to another animal, but it's usually off considerably. And when you actually plug these into some sound analysis software, the phonic structure is completely different from the animal it's supposed to sound like, meaning it came from something else. Wood knocks aren't all that common, at least not in the area south of here, but they do occur. So, little thing on markers. X markers, you can see this is one that was taken back in the Frog Pond area. And this is another one that was taken at Turkey Timbers. What's interesting is these markers are not being built the same way in the same areas. So we're kind of speculating that there's some slight variations in them per tree. If indeed that's what's making the markers. Okay. This is two different TP type structures. This was one in Toxic Timbers, and a part of it we call the marker area. And what had happened is this tree had been broke over. This tree had actually been jammed into the ground. Then the top of another tree had been set back in here. And that marker was about 30 feet tall. This is one that we found down along Boggy Creek. And what happened here is this one had been jammed into the ground. There's a sapling that goes up here, and it's actually wrapped around this smaller one. It comes up here, which has been twisted, and it's all resting with the other one formed by a sapling, kind of supporting the weight. Go on. This is another marker area pick from Toxic Timbers. And this tree is green, so it's in the springtime. And not only that, but when you get down here, it has been wrapped around another tree, anchoring it. This kind of shows a tree twist taken in the runestone area where something has broke a tree. You know, it takes pretty good muscle just to do that for a tree. Tall boy trails, and it's not quite clear, I'll have to point it out. These are the trails that the Squatch use. Originally they were coined by Dr. Hallmark. We have found that in this region they often will parallel a game trail. A lot of times when hoofed animals will walk through an area, if there's vines and stuff on the ground and branches, they'll plow straight on through it like a bulldozer. In these cases, something will have stepped over them. They often form a zigzag pattern moving through there. Overhead branches are usually cleared off up to around 8 foot. And you find their trails, you'll start finding prints. And this trail, again, this is toxic timbers. It actually goes up in here, goes back here, loops back around, and goes back in there. And this trail actually completely encircles a small community that's had reports. Footprint ponds. In the cross timbers, you don't find a whole lot of adult prints because the adults tend to walk in the leaf litter. Instead, you'll see a lot of leaf litter impressions. But we do find a lot of juvie prints. And we think what happens is the young ones aren't quite experienced enough to figure out that if they step in the mud, that'll leave a print that could get them led to. And the adults are a little bit more cautious about it. That was a trackway in the Arbuckles, and one of the casts back there that has clear toes was cast there. That had about 7 foot stride. Estimating height from footprints. This is a rough formula that we kind of put together. And basically, to get a rough idea of how big a squatch is, you take the track length in inches, divide it by 2, and if you just can kind of convert that to feet, let's say 12 inches would be, half of that's 6 inches, then you got essentially a 6-foot animal, give or take a few inches. It's not exact, but it comes fairly close in Bigfoot. As the example there, I listed Patty's print is 14.5 inches long. And, 7'4", 7'5" is the rough estimate for Patty. This print back here is about an 18-inch print, so that translates roughly into about a 9-foot individual. And that was taken here in Cleveland County. Put that down. A couple more examples of footprints just to show you what they look like. Here's one from the Arbuckles. It's a 19-inch print that was cast on a rock. And when it put its foot down and raised up, it removed a lot of the detritus here, so you can see the outline of the print. Not a lot of detail because it was on the rock. Here's another one from leaf litter in the frog pond area. You got a heel back here about even with my foot. The toes are way up here, and you can see the leaves have been mashed down. That's kind of what you tend to find where the adults have been walking around out here. Snow prints. There's a big problem with footprints you find in the snow. Snow melts, and when it melts, it distorts prints, makes them look bigger than they are. So if you're going to find a good print in the snow, it needs to be in freezing temperatures, and it needs to be fresh. The case of this one was actually taken in toxic timbers during the blizzard. I drove out down the road and came back right after the blizzard, and this was going across the road. And what I think is it was one in 4x4 mode because you've actually got toe impressions in the front of this. And I might add that that was about 1.5 miles away from any human settlement, so I don't know about you, but I'm not walking a couple miles barefoot through the snow. Small towns. A lot of these small towns actually have nicknames for these creatures, but they don't like to share it with locals. One of the reasons I've gotten so many sighting reports in the toxic timber area is I am a local. So here's just a list of some of the names that I've stumbled across. The Wayne White Thing, Kreiner Creature, Washington Werewolf, Old Henry, Birchy Beast, Blue Monster, Cleveland Creature, the Hare Hulk of Norman, Purcell Skunk Woman, Wild Man of the Tabletops. I could go on for a long time. A lot of these small towns, they know about these animals there, and they just don't talk about it. While we're talking about towns, a lot of people think you cannot have activity near a town. And this sighting report blew me out of the water. It shocked me. I got a report from a co-worker. I got here at Streams and Roars, and I went down to this little trailer park. When I was talking to the people in that trailer park, I started hearing the same things over and over. We're hearing screams and roars out on the creek. And I talked to the co-worker's wife, who said she saw this big black figure running across the field down towards the creek. And what gets me is this is not a quarter-mile away from the mainstream of not a little town at all, a decent-sized town, actually. In fact, there is a Sonic at the end of this road in front of the trailer park. This just blew me out of the water. Well, I talked to the people that live in this house right here, and they were telling me about some weird things. Animals disappearing, weird noises on the creeks. Something picked one of their cats up and was carrying it around. They were hearing their cat meowing 7 foot off the ground in their yard with no trees there. Something was pulling, they would water the local animals during the drought. They put this horse water out, and something would drain this horse water overnight, and the horse water would be set back up by their front door in the morning. So something was carrying it from their yard into the area right in front of their door. And I went back here. There's some little red dots that are kind of hard to make out, but that's basically a trackway that I started following. Everybody said that this old house, they hear weird noises at, and it led right behind this old house. And what it seems to have happened is during the drought, one of the troops in the toxic timber area that I study broke apart. And that one of them came up there and holed up during the worst of the drought. In fact, the footprints that we cast there, not only were they large, they matched one of the ones we cast in toxic timbers. It was the same animal. It had a very unique structure to its foot. This is actually the stream that it was following. And people say, well, how could one go into a town? There's how it happens. You got a deep cut stream with a lot of cover around it that's hooked up to an easy travel path. Most people aren't really paying a whole lot of attention, and it's the resources from the area that draw it in. In fact, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but a little further up in Oklahoma City, there is a herd of about a dozen deer that sneak into the city every night through the housing areas and go graze right along I-35, unnoticed. And the only reason I know about it is our security camera at work catches them. This is one of the prints in the trackway. In fact, this print is actually back there in the case. They can see the toes up in here, and then there's the heel back here. And that was one of 4 or 5 prints that we found moving through that area. Dumpsters. That's a good reason for me to go into this one. A lot of uneaten food gets thrown in the dumpsters. When we go to the dumpsters, sometimes we find fingerprints and footprints. This dumpster right here in particular, there was a cafe in that area, and a woman went to take out the trash that morning and said she saw something red and hairy walking along this fence row, heading to the woods. And she said it was taller than the fence, and that is about a 6.5 foot fence. All right. Family units. Okay, our research has kind of suggested that Bigfoot live in family units like most other primates, that they seem to patrol territories, and the average group, at least the average group we seem to run across, is between 5 and 10 individuals, but these may be subsets of a much larger group. Whenever they break up the forage in the western area, it seems to be 2 to 3 individuals. Whenever they come in close to humans, a lot of times the adults will be in the back, and they seem to send the smaller ones in to scavenge, which it makes sense. If you're 8.5 feet tall and you've got a 6-foot teenage squatch, then he's less likely to be seen than you are. And whenever one is often seen, it's usually a diversionary tactic. You've got Big Mama or Big Papa bouncing around trying to get your attention off of the baby. Go on. Seasonal sighting shifts. This is kind of just some rough estimates of some of the travel routes, but one of the things we've noticed is we've collected sightings, the footprint evidence, and everything else in these research areas is that the sightings shift a little bit with the seasons. And we think this is typically due to water availability. For example, one group we study moves a bit closer to the Canadian during the wintertime when it's flowing, but then it moves back down towards the Washita whenever it's summertime, because the Washita hardly ever dries up. Bigfoot growth rate. They grow roughly a third faster than humans, and I'm going to tell you how we came to this conclusion in a second. Based on that evidence, and compared to other primates, we kind of guessed that them maybe breeding around 10 to 13 years of age. And we got all this data because of the toxic timber troop. It has been studied and examined more than any other troop in western Oklahoma. And over an 8-year period, we have actually got plenty of sighting reports of these 2 young ones that have steadily grown up. Based on the footprint evidence in these reports, and from the witnesses that have told us about it, and from those of us that have seen them, we've got a rough idea of how fast these things grow now. This is basically just one chunk of the data for the juvies from toxic timbers. As you can kind of see there, we've got footprint finds using the formula and sightings to go by, and the estimated sizes from them in this deal. They steadily got bigger over, since 2004. In fact, right now, I'm guessing they're probably bigger than me. When you plot this all off on the data, you got 2004, which is where they were seen crossing a road. There's this long, slow, steady growth climb right here. Right around 2008, all of a sudden it picks up. This is where we think the squatch really start bulking out. And down here, you've got another set of really small, long growth that matches that one over there. And this is another one. This is another baby in the area. Now we got another dot down here, and the reason we got that is a newborn was just seen this year. In fact, and it's not on here, but a couple of those cats we cast the other day from this little fella, and this little fellow now is starting to hit this point, judging from those prints, just under 4 foot. A lot of people will ask how big can they get them. One of the common things you read on the internet is that in the southern states they don't get very big. However, we've got a lot of reports in the western part of the state of them in the 9 to 10 foot range and 18 to 20 inch tracks. A lot of the females that we've had reported to us are right around 7 foot. 9 foot seems, 8 to 9 feet seems to kind of be the average for the adult male. And that brings us to what we mentioned earlier, Gigantor. This monster, over the past 2 decades, we've got sighting reports of him now. It is just so far outside the range, we think he's kind of the equivalent of a 8-foot human. He leaves 26-inch footprints, and the sighting reports, interestingly enough, Dr. Charles Hallmark and Tukalona Shoba got reports of him too. They all indicate that this squatch is roughly 13 foot tall. He is completely monstrous. His footprints, it's kind of hard to make out here, but it's back here by here, and it goes all the way up here. That's a pack of cigarettes. His foot's roughly a foot wide. And it's not slide because we have found this track multiple times down in there. There are 2 of the casts, we already saw this picture earlier, of this particular squatch being held side by side, 10 years apart, and you can see it's the same animal. Let's see, we received 2 sighting reports of a 13 foot tall Bigfoot in the area. That would have to be him. And then on a recent expedition, several of our members reported hearing footsteps. Now, what's interesting to note that one of these members was in an area where we had an 8-foot squatch walk beside him. He said he heard him, but it didn't shake the ground. These steps were shaking the ground kind of like when a bull stops. So clearly this animal was much bigger. Variation in sighting reports in Oklahoma. The sighting reports in Oklahoma seem to fall in two major categories. The robust forms, which seem to be primarily the western and flatland river bottoms, and then along the Red River, pretty much all along the Red River, and the western arbuckles. And what I'm saying, I'll talk a little bit more about the robust form, and then the areas that they're in researches, and the mountains primarily, we get a report of a little thinner version, but we don't know exactly what's going on there, if it's diet or if it's because they're having to exert a lot more energy going up and down mountains. Can go on. But both of these kind of really represent what's being seen. The more athletic version is the one over there, the mountain form. As you can see, he's kind of a thin but athletic build, kind of like a basketball player. And then the flatland guys, for some reason, are all bulky and look like they eat steroids for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This is basically going into the same thing I was referring to. If this is a dietary thing, these excess calories, instead of being burnt off, would just simply go into growth. They're roughly the same height. It's just, for some reason, this part of the state, they're big. Go on. Variation in hair color. Now this is kind of interesting because known primates exhibit tremendous variation in hair color. For example, most people think orangutans are red. That's a picture of a black orangutan. They also come in blonde. They come in brown. And the Sasquatch reports, we typically get reports of black and brown Bigfoot. They seem to turn a silvery gray as they age, primarily in the head and shoulders. Kind of results in what we've dubbed the reverse silverback on occasion. Sometimes they go bald. What's interesting is you go across the state, the color seems to change a little. Primarily in the eastern part, it's what, black? There?
In the eastern part? It's more of a
Light tan?
yeah.
This area is typically almost a reddish brown. You go out further down in the mountains, that all the reports are blonde. There's probably some genetic reason for this. During the drought, as I said, the toxic timber troops seem to break up. We weren't getting reports of them, reports of vocalizations in one area, like we were before. When they moved into, that one I mentioned moved into an urban area. Other ones seem to be hanging around small farms and parks and whatnot, and drinking out of those. The design of those hydrants has not changed too terribly much in the past 200 years. And the reason we think they were drinking out of them is we were finding barefoot footprints and possible squatch sign in areas where these were. In fact, I actually cast a footprint at the base of one of these in Maricopa County during the drought. And if you're thinking about it, if you need fresh water, since the ponds are stagnated, and you're living in an area where a park's at, right there is a pretty available source of water if you go in at night. General conclusion, basically not only are there squatch in this area, they seem to be doing quite well in this area. And with that, I guess this is going to conclude the conference. Does anybody have any questions?
I got one for you. The sightings over the last 5 years seem to have been growing compared to, I'm going to say, in my area alone, 10 years previous to that. Do you think that's because the population is coming back heavier, kind of like the deer populations are, or do you think that's just because people might be moving more towards where people are at?
It could be a little bit of both. A lot of people aren't aware of this, but in the latter part of the 1800s, white-tailed deer in this region will almost come to extinction.
Yes.
But you're right. As soon as the deer population started picking up, you started hearing stories about them again. And something kind of interest here is we weren't really sprawled out like we are now. Now there's more people living in the areas where they're at, so you're going to get more sightings. And now there's actually groups to talk to about it. So,
Well, kind of add this, over on my side of the state, more and more people are moving trailers out into areas where we've never been before. We're actually encroaching on areas that they've been real confident of being able to move around without any problems. Now, shoot, somebody going with a bulldozer and knock down a half a dozen trees, put a trailer up. And, a Bigfoot will come up and start banging on the side of the trailer. So that's how we figured we're getting more and more sightings that way, because we're pushing in on their area and we're starting to push back.
It makes a lot of sense. It's basically the same way it is up in that neck of the woods.
well, are there any other questions?
I've got one.
All right.
You've got a lot of data in the toxic timber region.
Yes.
How did you compile all that and not have video or photographs?
Unfortunately, that's just the way this kind of went. And yes, we do have photographs from the toxic timber region, but unfortunately, they did not come in close enough range to get good quality photographs. This area, a lot of the times they come in late at night, and we tried putting infrared cameras out there to catch them, but when we did that, they quit coming up. And we really suspect that they can see into the infrared spectrum after some of the stuff happened. Most animals actually can. Most trail cams have infrared light, as Carl was talking about earlier. If you've ever noticed, whenever they take pictures of deer, what's the deer looking at?
Camera.
And in fact, there are some people that have reported that they can see a faint glow coming off these cameras. So, most of the security cameras we have tried out there are infrared, and at the time, I was pretty much the only researcher, and at that time I was a real college student, so that was a large factor there.
Okay, I mentioned that they're using the creeks. Creek camps and they're walking in the residential areas where this is the town. I had a guy call me up and he said that he had the same kind of thing happening out in California. And I went out there with him, we got a program of peakers, really good peakers.
Yeah.
Same thing, in the creeks, and there was houses on either side. And he said the same thing, they use the creeks and go right in the creek, and they don't want to notice.
Yeah.
He sits up in the bank of the creek, and he watches them go back and forth through there, and he stops the video, and he's also researching their eyesight. He claims they can communicate with them. I haven't seen that myself.
Well, I've never heard anything like that, but yeah, they do seem to be doing that. And it's not that big of a secret that animals will do that, because I know in some of the areas, bears are actually doing the same thing. That's one of the reasons how the bears in this part of the state have stayed off the radar. They're doing the exact same thing. They're following the creeks. And, these areas that they're coming into these small towns at, right on the edge of them, like I said, they can just simply follow the creek in, poke around a little bit, and then leave with nobody knowing about it.
What they're doing, it's like,
Any reports off reservations and stuff, or is that pretty much strictly?
Actually, we have done some investigations on reservations. And from what we've gathered, a lot of these local tribes apparently feed them.
Now, does this organization believe in the spiritual aspect? I heard.
No. Flesh and blood animal. If you look in Indian mythology and stories that are passed down, a lot of normal animals are assigned mystical powers too. One of the ones you hear around here is owls can will death on you. Like if you see an owl and it wants you to die within a few days, you'll drop dead from a heart attack or something. Clearly owls cannot do that. So just because they assign mystical powers to it, a lot of the tribal people do, does not mean they have it.
How well does this group play with other people, the FRO, with TBRC?
We've got friends in most of the other groups.
Okay.
And we work with some of the others. We've got a member from GCBRO, and we've got some members that are independents that go out with us, and we just kind of adopt them in.
Yeah, like Robert, he's been adopted whether he likes it or not.
Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering if you've had any sightings or reports just in the last couple of years in Roger Mills County?
In Roger Mills. Not within the last few years, but I know of sighting reports in Roger Mills County. There was a couple of cops that were on patrol out there in between Ledley and Cheyenne back in the 70s, and they seen one cross the road. There was a report from some farmers out there of seeing one when they were on their tractor. And just across on the Texas line, I actually got a report this summer from a sighting that happened in 2004. So,
My daughter was hunting there last year, and I 36 in the morning, because swore I heard whoops way off in the distance. Not to the point that she was scared. She was getting kind of nervous about herself.
yeah, I've heard some reports out that way. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some out there, because that area is remote.
Oh, yeah, it's very tricky.
Like I said, you got spots out in the western part, you can ride your best gas up. So, if there's not any more questions, I can go ahead and I'll call them into the conference, and everybody can be on their way before it decides to get all nasty on us.
We need the MNTRC members for pictures.
Yes. All MABRC members, please come on up. We're gonna